America's most powerful military alliance, just fractured in real time. A total of 26 NATO member nations, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland, released a joint emergency declaration at midnight Brussels time condemning a unilateral announcement from President Trump that threatens to trigger the alliance's Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause, the clause that has kept the Western world out of a Third World War for 76 years. And this isn't diplomatic friction or routine disagreement between allies. This is a formal, coordinated rebuke signed by heads of state who flew their defense ministers to Brussels on 6 hours' notice, using language that NATO's own Secretary General described, in a statement released to the press at 2:00 a.m., as the gravest challenge to collective security since the Cold War ended. When the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, America's closest ally, stands at a podium in the middle of the night flanked by the leaders of Germany and France and says the United States has placed allied forces in direct jeopardy, the foundation of the most successful military alliance in human history just cracked at its base. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So what triggered this unprecedented allied revolt? According to multiple senior NATO officials and diplomatic sources who were briefed on the crisis, the breaking point came at 11:47 p.m. Central European Time on February 22nd, when President Trump released what the White House called a security posture realignment, a unilateral declaration made without consulting a single NATO partner, announcing that the United States would suspend its Article 5 obligations to any NATO member that has not met the 2% GDP defense spending threshold. In practical terms, that means the United States just told 11 NATO allies, including Montenegro, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal, that American forces will not come to their defense if they are attacked. Sources familiar with the Allied response say the evidence of the declaration's impact includes intercepted communications from adversarial governments celebrating the announcement, emergency cables from U.S. ambassadors warning of catastrophic damage to bilateral relationships, and sworn assessments from 4 senior NATO military commanders stating the declaration has already begun degrading real-time military coordination. This isn't just another foreign policy disagreement or a dispute over burden sharing. Constitutional scholars and former national security officials are calling this the most serious unilateral executive action in American foreign policy since the Truman Doctrine. And believe me, when defense ministers who have spent their careers defending the transatlantic relationship now use the phrase abandonment of sacred obligations in an official midnight declaration, something catastrophic has shattered at the core of the Western alliance. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions have been building since January, when Trump began issuing a series of ultimatums to NATO allies demanding they meet the 2% GDP defense spending target by the end of the first quarter, a timeline most economists described as structurally impossible for democratic parliaments to meet. But everything escalated into a full-blown crisis on the night of February 21st, when a classified internal communication from the National Security Council, later confirmed as authentic by 3 separate U.S. officials speaking on condition of anonymity, was shared with the governments of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. That document, described by diplomats who reviewed it as unlike anything they had seen in 40 years of alliance management, indicated the Trump administration was preparing to formally notify NATO of a conditional suspension of Article 5 commitments within 48 hours, and that no allied consultation had been planned. The briefing that followed, conducted in the NATO Secure Communications Facility in Brussels by Deputy Secretary General Mircea Joana and attended by defense ministers and senior military commanders from all 30 member states, lasted 6 hours. According to 3 officials who were present, the room was shaken in a way rarely seen even during the darkest days of the Cold War. According to senior officials who described the session afterward, the briefing detailed the specific language of the planned declaration, its timeline, and its potential impact on ongoing military operations in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and the Indo-Pacific region. This wasn't about disagreements over strategy or burden-sharing timelines. This was about the unilateral dismantling of the legal and moral architecture that has prevented a catastrophic war between great powers since 1949. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here's where it really gets serious. Within 4 hours of the classified briefing ending, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called an emergency convening of what officials described as the Core Five: France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Canada, in a secure conference room on the 3rd floor of NATO headquarters. According to senior diplomatic officials briefed on the meeting, All 5 heads of state or their direct deputies attended. The session lasted 3 hours, and what happened inside, according to officials who later spoke on condition of anonymity, was described as the most consequential gathering of Allied leaders on American soil or European soil in the post-Cold War era. Prime Minister Sunak opened the session by stating plainly, according to sources who recounted his remarks, "What we have before us is not a negotiating position. It is a declaration that America's word, the word that entire nations have built their security around for 3 generations, is now conditional. If we do not respond with absolute unity tonight, adversaries watching this in Moscow and Beijing will draw the only conclusion available to them. We cannot allow that conclusion to stand unchallenged." The room fell silent. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who has personally invested significant political capital in maintaining transatlantic unity despite fierce domestic pressure, reportedly stood and said, his voice steady but his expression visibly grave according to witnesses, "I have spent 4 years defending the relationship with Washington against critics in my own parliament who said it could not be trusted. Tonight, those critics are correct. This is not a dispute about money. This is a declaration that the shield we have relied upon since the Marshall Plan is now available only to those who meet American conditions. That is not a shield, that is leverage, and we must say so publicly, together, and tonight." According to officials present, Chancellor Scholz's statement solidified what had until that moment been a fractious debate about whether to respond publicly at all. French President Emmanuel Macron, attending by secure video link from the Élysée Palace, reportedly added, "The intelligence from adversarial capitals is already moving. Every hour we wait, the calculation in Moscow changes in ways we cannot reverse. The declaration must be repudiated before markets open in New York. There is no other option." Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely explosive. By 11:30 p.m. Brussels time, the group had finalized the language of a joint declaration. An extraordinary step given that NATO declarations of this weight typically require weeks of diplomatic negotiation and unanimous consent. But according to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who explained the decision in a statement released simultaneously in 7 languages, when the foundational architecture of collective defense is placed in question by a unilateral executive action affecting the security of 26 nations, the alliance has a duty to respond with clarity and speed. We are fulfilling that duty. The Midnight Declaration, released publicly at precisely 12:00 a.m. Brussels time on February 23rd, contained 3 specific charges. First, the declaration formally stated that the Trump announcement violated Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which requires all member states to refrain from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Language that NATO's own legal counsel interpreted as binding on member states' commitments to each other. Second, the declaration invoked Article 8, which specifies that no member may enter into any international engagement in conflict with the treaty, arguing that the conditional suspension of Article 5 constitutes exactly such a conflicting engagement. Third, and most devastatingly, the declaration included a formal request signed by 26 of 30 NATO member nations for an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council under Article 12, a mechanism that has never been formally invoked against a member state in the alliance's 76-year history. But the truly devastating detail came in an annex released alongside the declaration. Citing classified intelligence shared by 3 separate Allied intelligence services, the document stated that within 90 minutes of the Trump administration's announcement, Russian state media had begun broadcasting the text of the declaration as evidence that, in their words, the American commitment to European security is now negotiable. NATO officials characterized this as precisely the kind of adversarial exploitation the alliance's founding architects feared most. This sent shockwaves through Washington and every Allied capital simultaneously. This isn't the first time the Trump administration has created friction with NATO partners. In his first term, Trump repeatedly threatened to withdraw from the alliance, questioned the value of Article 5, and publicly sided with adversarial governments in disputes with allies. But the circumstances are fundamentally different now. During the first term, the friction was rhetorical. Defense secretaries and national security advisors repeatedly assured allies the formal commitment was intact. Career diplomats worked back channels to reassure partners. The alliance held together despite turbulence. Now it is completely different. This declaration is not rhetorical. It is a formal written statement from the White House suspending obligations under a binding treaty. The response involves 26 member nations, not procedural complaints from a handful of smaller states. And unlike previous disputes, this one has triggered the formal invocation of treaty mechanisms designed for crisis, not for burden-sharing disagreements. The pattern is clear. The alliance absorbed Trump's first-term pressure through institutional resilience. But when the executive branch issues a written suspension of treaty obligations, even institutional resilience has limits. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. So what exactly triggered this mass allied response? According to senior NATO officials and diplomatic sources familiar with the classified intelligence, 3 specific pieces of evidence proved dispositive in pushing allied governments from private concern to public declaration. First, intercepted adversarial communications showing immediate exploitation of the announcement. Allied Signals Intelligence Services, specifically GCHQ in the United Kingdom and BND in Germany, presented NATO leadership with decrypted communications from Russian and Chinese government officials circulated within hours of the Trump announcement. According to a senior NATO military official who described the intercepts in general terms without revealing classified details, the communications make absolutely clear that adversarial governments understood the announcement not as a negotiating position, but as a genuine signal of American withdrawal. They were already adjusting military planning assumptions within the first hour. The speed of that response was unlike anything we had seen since the end of the Cold War. Second, financial intelligence showing immediate market and security consequences. Within 6 hours of the White House announcement, sovereign credit rating models for 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, triggered automatic downgrade reviews because of the changed security guarantee assumptions embedded in those ratings. According to Dr. Claudia Buch, European Central Bank Vice President, who addressed the issue in an emergency statement, the conditional suspension of security guarantees is not a political abstraction. It reprices sovereign risk for every nation in the alliance whose security premium has been built on the assumption of collective defense. The market implications are immediate, material, and deeply serious. Here's the absolute kicker. The third piece of evidence involves direct testimony from senior U.S. military commanders who privately informed Allied defense ministers that the announcement had not gone through the standard interagency review process that governs major national security decisions. 4 serving U.S. military officers, including 2 combatant commanders responsible for NATO integrated operations, provided assessments through proper channels stating that the declaration had created immediate coordination problems in active military exercises across the Baltic region, and that Allied counterparts had already begun requesting clarification of U.S. commitments before proceeding with joint operations. One written assessment, portions of which were shared with Allied governments and described by officials who reviewed it, stated, "The unilateral nature of the announcement has created operational ambiguity that adversaries can and will exploit. We are requesting immediate clarification of commitments before proceeding with scheduled integrated exercises." Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm everyone, regardless of political affiliation. This isn't just about the Trump administration or this specific declaration. If a president can unilaterally suspend treaty obligations that form the foundation of Allied security, obligations ratified by the Senate, embedded in international law, and relied upon by 30 nations for 3 generations, without triggering any formal accountability mechanism, the treaty system that has governed international security since World War II effectively ceases to function. Once that precedent is established, future presidents of either party will understand they can selectively honor or suspend treaty commitments based on conditions they set unilaterally. The constitutional system, which requires Senate consent for treaty obligations, doesn't survive that precedent intact. This puts the Trump administration in an absolutely impossible political and legal position. On one side, the administration faces a formal Allied declaration invoking treaty mechanisms never before used against a member state, meaning the institutional response is now on the public record and cannot be dismissed as private diplomatic concern. On the other side, the administration confronts operational military assessments from its own commanders describing immediate security consequences, meaning the claim that the announcement is purely rhetorical is directly contradicted by serving officers. And here's the impossible bind. If the White House claims the announcement was misunderstood and Article 5 remains fully intact, it directly contradicts the written text of the declaration, which in plain language makes U.S. commitments conditional on defense spending. If it insists the conditionality is real but frames it as leverage, it validates the Allied reading of the declaration and confirms exactly the adversarial exploitation documented in Allied intelligence intercepts. If it argues the President has inherent authority to condition treaty obligations unilaterally, it triggers a direct constitutional confrontation with the Senate, which ratified the treaty and has always considered its provisions binding. There's no defense strategy that addresses all three pieces of evidence simultaneously. Constitutional scholars and former national security officials are calling this the gravest crisis in the history of the transatlantic alliance. Professor Anne-Marie Slaughter, former director of policy planning at the State Department and professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, stated on CNN, "What we are watching is the voluntary dismantling of an architecture that took a generation to build after the most destructive war in human history. The founders of this alliance specifically designed it to be immune to exactly this kind of unilateral executive action. That design is now being stress-tested in real time." Former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, retired Admiral James Stavridis, told MSNBC that the declaration's impact on operational military reality cannot be overstated. When Allied commanders in the field begin requesting clarification of U.S. commitments before proceeding with joint exercises, the alliance has already been functionally degraded. You cannot restore that confidence with a press release. It requires actions, not words, and those actions take months. Even former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who has consistently defended aggressive American foreign policy and criticized Allied free-riding, wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "Whatever one believes about burden-sharing obligations, the unilateral suspension of Article 5 commitments without Allied consultation is not how an alliance leader operates. It is how an alliance abandons leadership. The consequences will be measured not in weeks but in decades." Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. So let's break down what this means. First, immediate paralysis of NATO operational planning. Every integrated military exercise, every forward deployment, every interoperability agreement between U.S. and allied forces now operates under conditions of legal and political ambiguity that military planners cannot simply absorb. Commanders on both sides are requesting clarification before proceeding. That hesitation, even if brief, is observable by adversaries and changes their risk calculations in real time. Second, massive implications for the broader alliance architecture. The formal invocation of Article 12 for an emergency North Atlantic Council session creates a legal record that binds all member states. If the United States refuses to attend or rejects the session's authority, it effectively removes itself from the alliance's decision-making structure. If it attends, it must answer, on the record, to 29 other member nations for a unilateral action that all 26 signatories to the Midnight Declaration have characterized as a treaty violation. Finally, long-term institutional consequences that will outlast this administration. The damage to Allied confidence in American treaty commitments is not restorable through subsequent declarations of good faith. Every future Allied defense planning cycle will now incorporate a political risk premium reflecting the possibility that American commitments are conditional. That premium shows up in military readiness, in procurement decisions, in forward deployment agreements, and in the willingness of Allied governments to share the most sensitive intelligence with American partners. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond the immediate political fallout, this represents a test of whether the constitutional system governing American treaty obligations can still function as designed. The founders created the treaty ratification process, requiring 2/3 of the Senate, specifically to prevent a single executive from unilaterally abandoning international commitments made in the nation's name. If the system works, Congress asserts its authority over treaty obligations and the declaration is rolled back. If the system fails, if partisan loyalty or institutional inertia prevents any congressional response, it establishes that the executive can unilaterally condition or suspend any ratified treaty commitment without consequence. This scenario is creating absolute pandemonium across the national security establishment and every Allied capital. Reports indicate the State Department has been in continuous emergency session since the Midnight Declaration was released, with senior officials attempting to manage the damage through bilateral channels while the White House maintains its public position. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Jim Risch has called for an emergency classified briefing on the declaration's impact, while Ranking Member Ben Cardin described the Allied response as exactly the outcome our adversaries have been hoping for since 1949. Republican leadership in the Senate faces an impossible choice: criticize the declaration and fracture the party's relationship with the White House, stay silent and absorb responsibility for whatever the alliance consequences turn out to be. Democratic leadership must decide whether to pursue a formal resolution reasserting Senate authority over treaty obligations, a move that has bipartisan support in concept but faces procedural obstacles in a Republican-controlled chamber. Meanwhile, the White House is in crisis mode. The president addressed the situation Thursday afternoon, calling the Allied declaration disrespectful, characterizing the NATO partners who signed it as ungrateful, and insisting that the declaration was completely misread by European governments. But foreign policy analysts immediately noted that the president did not withdraw or modify the language of the original announcement and offered no specific commitment that Article 5 remains unconditional for any member state. Stay with me, because what comes next will completely change your understanding of where this leads. Here's what makes the administration's position so precarious and its response so strategically disastrous. By characterizing allied governments as disrespectful and ungrateful, rather than addressing the substance of their legal concerns, the administration is alienating the very governments whose cooperation it needs to resolve the crisis. The formal Article 12 process requires American participation to produce any outcome short of a full rupture. By framing the Allied response as ingratitude rather than treaty enforcement, the administration gives every wavering NATO partner additional justification for strengthening the Midnight Declaration coalition, because no government can now join the American position without appearing to validate the characterization that defending treaty obligations is disrespect. Former Ambassador Nicholas Burns, who served as U.S. ambassador to NATO and later to China, noted publicly, "Every statement from the White House that attacks the character of the Allied response rather than addressing the substance makes the next Allied statement more unified and more forceful. The administration is doing the work of its critics for them." Former State Department Counselor Philip Zelikow observed, "The pattern of attacking the process rather than engaging the substance is by now familiar. It works to consolidate domestic support. It is catastrophic for alliance management. These are not the same audience." This goes far beyond one declaration or one administration. It's about whether the United States can maintain a system where treaty commitments made by one generation of leaders remain binding on their successors. If a president can suspend those commitments by executive announcement without triggering any formal accountability mechanism, then every adversary and every ally will permanently adjust their behavior to reflect that possibility. That is not just damaging, it is the end of American credibility as an alliance leader. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's the current situation. 26 NATO member nations have signed a formal Midnight Declaration invoking treaty mechanisms never before used against a member state based on a unilateral White House announcement suspending Article 5 commitments for 11 allies. The North Atlantic Council must now convene an emergency session under Article 12, the first such invocation in the alliance's 76-year history. The United States faces a genuine choice between defending the declaration's language and confronting the formal Allied record of objection, or rolling back the declaration and absorbing significant domestic political cost. And the entire constitutional framework governing American treaty obligations faces the test of whether executive action can override Senate-ratified commitments without consequence. This isn't political theater or routine foreign policy friction. This is the closest America has come to unilaterally dismantling its own alliance leadership since the United States declined to join the League of Nations a century ago, and the consequences of that choice took 20 years to manifest catastrophically. When 26 of 30 allied governments sign a formal declaration invoking treaty mechanisms at midnight rather than waiting for morning. When serving U.S. military commanders request clarification of American commitments before proceeding with joint operations. When even consistent critics of Allied burden sharing characterize the administration's action as an abandonment of alliance leadership. The system is being tested in ways it has never faced before. Keep an extremely close eye on this story, because the emergency North Atlantic Council session will determine not just the immediate fate of the declaration, but the long-term architecture of American security commitments across the entire world. The session is expected to convene within 10 days. American representatives will face direct questioning on the record from 29 allied governments. Defense ministers will present the intelligence intercepts documenting adversarial exploitation of the announcement. And at the end of that session, the North Atlantic Council will produce a formal record that becomes part of the permanent treaty framework, a record that every future American administration will inherit. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this, because this constitutional and alliance crisis is unfolding in real time and represents the most serious challenge to American credibility as a treaty partner in modern history. Here's where things stand right now. The United States, for the first time in the alliance's history, faces a formal treaty invocation mechanism brought by 26 of its own partners in response to a unilateral executive action. The evidence underpinning the Allied response includes adversarial intelligence, financial market assessments, and operational military reports from American commanders themselves. The administration's response of attacking the character of the Allied reaction rather than addressing the substance of the treaty concerns appears to be accelerating rather than slowing the Allied coalition's consolidation. What happens in the coming days will determine whether American treaty commitments retain their unconditional character, or whether the world moves permanently into an era where even the most binding security guarantees carry an asterisk. The declaration has been signed, the Council will convene, and the entire post-war security order watches to see whether the constitutional and diplomatic system designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action can still function as its architects intended. The stakes have never been higher for the alliance as an institution, the evidence has never been more concrete, and the constitutional test has never been more immediate. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage.